and welcome back to the Festival of the Unexplained. Now, Catherine's done some amazing readings there, hasn't she? So I hope all of you who've had readings today actually leave a comment and just make sure that, you know, people know about her, because she is amazing. So firstly, I want to say thank you to my next guest, who joins me all the way from the northwest of England. He's actually a Victorian storyteller, but also dabbles a little bit more inside the paranormal. Now, I have the greatest pleasure of welcoming Stephen Mercer. So thank you very much for joining us. Hello, Stephen.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
I can now.
Excellent. I can't see anything, but it's great to be here.
Bless you. We had a couple of technical issues, didn't we, before, but we seem to have ironed them out now.
We did, but unfortunately, I can only see the number 9 on screen, but it is great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
No, thank you very much for taking part. So just introduce yourself and explain to the viewers what you actually do up in the Northwest.
Okay, well, I'm Stephen, and I started supernatural events. That's what I call my events company. And I started this, believe it or not, on Halloween night 14 years ago.
Wow.
And that was to do a one-off guided tour around the Grand Theatre in Blackpool. It's a charity, and it was to raise funds. And from that one tour, I started to take people around other locations within Blackpool, strange sites such as Blackpool Zoo, the North Pier Theatre, many different locations all across Blackpool and the Fylde Coast. And as well as doing ghost tours and paranormal investigations with the public, 10 years ago, I set up Blackpool Ghost Walks, an outside walking tour where I dress in Victorian costume and I take people around the promenade area, into the town centre, into some old alleyways and lanes, and I tell them the stories that are attached to buildings, theatres, outside spaces.
And that brings us to me zipping off and you telling some of our viewers some amazing stories that you have.
I shall do my best. I shall do my best.
No problem.
Well, I think it's just me now on my own. And where should I start? But perhaps Blackpool's oldest attraction. Blackpool itself is not an old city, an old town. Many people ask me whenever I'm doing my ghost walks, why are you doing them in Blackpool? It's not like York or Chester or London or Edinburgh. It's not an old city. And the answer is quite simple. It doesn't have to be an old city. It just has to have ghosts and hauntings. And Blackpool has many of those. Blackpool only dates back to the 1400s. Back in the 1400s, all we had in this area was the beach, the sea, and a lot of marshland. But over the years, people moved into the area, pushing back the marshland and building homes, lodging houses, and people did come into the area. However, our first guests, our first visitors, weren't holidaymakers, weren't tourists as they are now. They were people from the outlying towns and villages who weren't well, who went to their physicians, their doctors, and their doctors suggested coming to the area, staying in the lodging houses, because in those early days, they truly believed that if you swam in the sea, in the salt waters, and breathed in that fresh sea air, it would cure you of your ailments. But those people who came, they enjoyed the area that much, and the area started to grow. They pushed back more marshland and they built more guest houses. Attractions eventually came. But the first attraction is where I want to start. The first attraction that was built was in 1863, and it was called Blackpool Pier. Now it's called North Pier because we have 3 piers. But North Pier was built as a promenade pier. Back in those days, what people would do when they came on holiday is promenade. They would walk, they would sit on the beach, but they would be dressed in their finery. And promenade piers were very popular back in the mid 1800s. But the pier wasn't long enough, it wasn't wide enough. We had to enlarge it, we had to make it longer, and people did come in their thousands just to walk along the pier. The pier has changed over the years, and there are many ghosts and hauntings associated with North Pier. One is a lovely story where you might meet the Victorian lady, a lady who sits on a bench next to an old lamppost on the main decking of the pier. Many people see her whenever they're walking off the pier. It never seems to be when they're walking on, only when they're leaving the pier. They'll see this lady sat on the bench next to the lamppost. And of course, because she looks different, she's wearing Victorian clothing, people stare and they watch as she maybe smiles at them and arises from that bench and starts to go further down the pier, out towards the sea end. But that's when people notice there's something a little bit odd about this lady, because they notice her skirts, they're not moving. Her legs aren't moving, she's not walking. The further away from you she gets, they realize that her feet are slightly above the decking, that she is gliding along the pier. A third of the way down the pier, that's when she will disappear. People, when they see that, they are astonished. But that's not where this story ends, because many of those who have seen her on the bench and disappearing, they'll go further down the pier towards the sea end. And down there's a Venetian two-tier carousel ride. And you might, if you're lucky, see the Victorian side saddle on one of the horses as it's going around and around the carousel. Now there's a center spindle on a carousel ride. So you'll be watching as people on horses, carriages, they disappear from view behind the center section and then come back into view. But if you see that lady in the Victorian clothing sat on that horse and she notices that you're watching, when she disappears with the horse behind that center spindle, only the horse comes back into view. She has disappeared. People panic. They think this poor lady has fallen off the ride. They run to the ride operator, demanding it be stopped. The ride, of course, is stopped. People run around to that side, the sea side of the ride, expecting to find this poor lady sprawled on the decking, but there's no one there. The ride operator hasn't seen anyone as they have described on that ride. Nobody has fallen off. Who is the Victorian lady? We're not 100% sure. However, we do have some idea of who it could be from a lady who used to do some heritage tours with me, but I'm still investigating. And that's what I do with my stories. If you were to experience something in Blackpool, then tell me. I would write it down, but I'd want to hear that same story 25, 30 or more times from people who don't know each other. And then I will investigate. I will research it and find out what really is happening. And only whenever I'm satisfied that this does happen, or perhaps that I've seen it myself, only then will I tell those stories on a Blackpool ghost walk, or even the ghost tram, an old heritage tram with Blackpool Heritage Tram Tours, where we go along the promenade and I again tell stories. But there are many stories in Blackpool. If we go a little bit further up the promenade, we come to Blackpool's most iconic attraction, Blackpool Tower. Now, Blackpool Tower, it was opened in 1894, as in the tower, the building was there before. And there are many tales inside the tower of hauntings. Stories from those that have played the Wurlitzer organ inside the beautiful ballroom, saying that when they had been walking underneath the stage, going to that room where the organ is housed, they would have to go into this room, sit in a seat, make themselves ready, and they would be lifted up onto the stage. As they're walking to that room, they hear the organ playing, but they're the ones that have the key in their hands. Nobody else is in that room. There's an elderly couple that is seen in the ballroom. They're sat at one of the tables. Now, some days the ballroom will do afternoon tea. And many who go to this afternoon tea, they will order their tea, their cakes, their sandwiches. They'll sit down at the table and those would be brought to them while they're sat at the table. And many of the staff over the years have talked about an elderly couple who have ordered simply a pot of tea for two. They've come back with the order, but there's nobody sat at the table. They'll set the tray with everything down on the table and they'll look around the dance floor, around the sides of this beautiful ballroom, looking for this elderly couple, but they can't see them. They'll turn to those that are sat on a table nearby and they'll ask, have you seen where the couple were that were sat here on this table? Those people look at the staff with surprise. There hasn't been anyone sat at that table. But I came over and I took their order. Oh, we saw you come over. We saw you at the table. We thought you were cleaning it. Yes, we heard you talking, but we thought perhaps you had an earpiece or you were talking to yourself. But there hasn't been anyone sat at the table. And sometimes they're told the couple did go out onto the dance floor. And again, they stand next to the table, scouring the dance floor, looking for the couple. And sometimes they do see them dancing with all the others around and around the ballroom. And they watch as this couple start to twirl, moving around the ballroom, getting closer and closer to the center of the ballroom floor. And when they get to the center, that's when that gentle twirl starts becoming quite fast. It speeds up. They go round and around and around, and then they vanish. The ballroom has many tales to tell, as do many others inside the tower. But I want to take you away from the tower. And I'm going to take you even further away down the promenade to the pleasure beach. The pleasure beach has been there for many, many years. A fun fair was on that site even before the pleasure beach opened. But there are some strange tales in the pleasure beach. The most well-known of these tales is that of Cloggy. Cloggy is a nickname for one of the ride operators that worked at the pleasure beach, mostly on the ghost train. One of his jobs would be to walk around the track before the pleasure beach would open, checking that everything was safe, everything was secure, and that the ghost train could open to the public. He was called Cloggy. It was a nickname because he wore clogs on his feet. And many of those other staff that were around, they used to hear him as he would walk along the tracks. That noise the clogs made on the tracks, they knew it. They could hear him before they could see him. They knew he was coming. Sadly, Cloggy passed away. But many of the staff, when they're going around checking the ride, even now, they still hear the sound of those clogs on the tracks. Is it Cloggy still checking the ride, making sure it is safe for others? I think so. Let's go away from the pleasure beach. And since we're on the prom, let's go away from Blackpool, a little bit further into the Fylde coast. I want to take you to Lytham. In Lytham, there is a wonderful theatre. It's the only theatre in the Fylde coast now, and it's called Lowther Pavilion. Lowther Pavilion originally was just a pavilion, and it was a bandstand. But over the years, it changed, mostly because some of the artists that performed in the bandstand were a bit cold in the winter months. So they created a theatre with walls, not just pillars and a roof. And many have performed in the Lowther Pavilion over the years. But many who are on that stage, they hear something coming from beneath the stage, whether it's in the middle of a performance or whether it's during a rehearsal, or maybe it's just the staff who are cleaning the stage. They hear the keys of a piano. A piano is stored underneath the stage. It's only brought up onto the stage when it's needed. But people hear the clink of a piano. There's many more things that go on in the Lowther Pavilion. In one of the dressing rooms, many people have complained that the door opens on its own. Those actors, musicians, those that are in that dressing room have heard the door open. They've looked over towards the door, expecting somebody to walk through, but it closes. It happens again. The door opens slightly. They run over, they grab the door, they pull the door open, but there's nobody there. There's no draft, there's no wind. It's an inside corridor. There are no windows apart from those inside the dressing rooms themselves. So what is opening the door? Why do many of those performers inside that dressing room suffer headaches and sickness? Who is wandering backstage through the dressing rooms underneath the stage? Is it the same phantom, the same spirit being, the same ghost that is playing the piano under the stage? Is it the same spirit that likes to scare people in one of the storerooms in the main auditorium? Again, staff who are in that storeroom, perhaps moving chairs, tables that are kept in there. They've heard voices, footsteps, knocking noises on the door, but there's never anyone there. There are many locations across the Fylde coast, many stories that I tell on ghost tours and ghost walks. But let's come back into Blackpool. And let me take you to a site that used to be where the Blackpool and the Stanley Park Aerodrome used to be. An aerodrome that was originally for pleasure flights, and the hangars that were there when it was the aerodrome are still there today, but they're used for a very different purpose, because on that site now is Blackpool Zoo. And Blackpool Zoo has seen many hauntings, many ghosts, many who were in one of those hangars. It was the old elephant house. The elephants now have a beautiful brand new building, a brand new home at the zoo. But in the old hangar where they used to live, many would see a man walking across the pen in between the elephants, a man wearing a boiler suit. They thought that he worked there, that he was going to work with the elephants. Perhaps he was going to take food to these beautiful creatures. But as he walked into the midst of these elephants, he disappeared. It wasn't that he vanished. It wasn't that he faded away. He was in and surrounded by the elephants. But then as the elephants started to move away, the man wasn't there. And he hadn't left. He hadn't walked again across that pen. He just vanished. Men wearing uniforms are seen at Blackpool Zoo in the grounds. The RAF, they used to take over the Stanley Park Aerodrome, and they would fly some of our troops off into war. Of course, many of those troops would be seen disappearing onto the plains, and some obviously came back again. A man wearing an RAF uniform is seen in part of the grounds where now the education building is. It used to be the original air traffic control tower. And it used to be an entrance where many would come in to go through that building to go out onto the runways. Are people seeing a man in an RAF uniform going through as if he's going into the airport to go perhaps and get into the pilot's seat of one of those aircraft? He's seen by many. He's seen not just by staff, but by visitors to the zoo. They wonder what's going on. Why is there a man in uniform? They don't expect it, but he does walk through the doors and disappears. A little bit outside Blackpool Zoo is a wonderful woodland area. It's on the drive from the main road to the zoo, and it's called Salisbury Woodland Gardens. There, people have also seen that man in the uniform, but also something else, something that I really don't understand, and that is a monk. A monk is seen wandering through the pathways around Salisbury Woodland Gardens. Now, I don't know any reason why this monk would be seen. I don't know in our history of the town of any building, any priory, anything that would give a reason for this monk. People that describe him say he's wearing a long cloak and a hood that covers his whole head and comes further out. They can't see a face, but they see him wandering around. I do wonder, is it a monk? Is it someone in some kind of long cloak, perhaps? Rather than a monk, is it somebody else? We haven't got to the bottom of that, but he has been seen by hundreds of people that wander through that woodland area and the next door golf course. People that have been out playing golf have seen him walking along this path next to a small stream, crossing over some of the bridges that are in this beautiful woodland area. That woodland is just across the road from Stanley Park, an award-winning park, beautiful park with a large lake, boats that go out onto the lake. There's fishing going on, and another area of this lake, there are rose gardens, fountains, absolutely stunning. If you come to Blackpool, you must pay it a visit. But not far from the entrance, from close by Salisbury Woodland Gardens, right next to that lake, there is a bench. And many who have sat on that bench, they've experienced something. Usually the people that have sat on the bench and have told this story are there walking their dogs. And when they get close to that bench, the dog starts barking like crazy. There's nobody to start off with on that bench. The dog just stands still, almost pointing nose straight towards this bench, starts barking, yelping, not happy at all, and then starts running behind people that this dog is with. That's when people see something happening where the bench is. They see figures rising up from the bench that weren't there. The figures were not there. The bench was empty. But then, after their dogs start barking, they do see two figures rising up from the bench and walking further away from them along the path in towards another part of these gardens. People that are sat on the bench, they sometimes feel as if somebody is sitting on their lap. Sometimes when they sit on the bench, it's almost like they get so far and then drop down, as if they have sat on somebody's lap. Then they've gone. Have a wander around Stanley Park. Not only will you be amazed at how beautiful it is, but you may be amazed at how haunted it is. Speaking of RAF, let me take you into the town centre, into the Winter Gardens. The Winter Gardens is a wonderful, wonderful place. It's one of our main entertainment leisure complexes. There are 2 theatres in there. There's a ballroom. There are 3 wonderful rooms combined called the Spanish Suite. But inside the Opera House, the largest of the theatres in there, that's when people see more men in uniform. Performers, while they're on the stage, looking out into the darkness, can sometimes see figures sat in the audience. But sometimes the lights do come up, and they do see many faces in the audience in front of them. And many have seen to their right, as they're staring into the auditorium, men, again, wearing uniforms. And they realize that those uniforms are RAF. And there are many of these men sat on one section of this auditorium. When I did my ghost walk last year, a lady interrupted my story. And I want to tell you her story because it is amazing and it really embraces the ghosts that are inside the Opera House. She and a friend had gone to see a show. It had got to the interval. They were sat in that section I've already mentioned. When it got to the interval, one of them, she needed the toilets. They got up from their seats and they walked to the very back of the auditorium. She decided she was going to go to the toilet. Her friend decided to wait at the back of the auditorium. She just wanted to have a look around and take in the vastness of the Opera House. As her friend was walking back after being to the ladies' toilets, she noticed a man in uniform, a man wearing an RAF uniform, walking along the back of the auditorium towards her friend. Her friend also noticed this man. He was wearing a hat. He took his hat off. He nodded to the lady, still stood at the back of the auditorium, and smiled. She smiled back at him and nodded. Her friend ran over to her. Did you see that man? Did you see him? He smiled at you. They were giddy like 2 small schoolgirls, laughing and joking, because this man, a handsome man in uniform, had said good evening, hello. They watched as that man walked down the center aisle as if he was going down to the stage. They decided to follow. They didn't know where he was sat. They hadn't seen him before. So they started to wander down that central aisle. They could see him weave in and out of people who were stood in the aisles just chatting while the interval was on. They saw him get to the very front, just in front of the stage. He turned to the left. They got to the bottom. They turned to the left too. They could see this man walking towards the seats where they were sat. He turned left, walking up the aisle. They had to do the same, but as they turned the corner to walk up that aisle, that's when they noticed the seats that they were in, and those seats that were surrounding them were full. They hadn't been before. There were people in some of the seats, but they certainly didn't expect the whole area to be full of men wearing RAF uniforms. They saw this gentleman walk in through the seats, and he sat down. Just then, before they could move, before they could figure out what was going on, the lights started to dim. They just sat down on the nearest 2 seats to them. They watched the show, but every now and again they would turn around, looking over their shoulders, looking to see if these men were still there. But it was too dark, they couldn't see. When the show ended and the lights in the auditorium came up, they jumped from their seats because they'd left their belongings at their seats. They looked around. Those seats, the ones that they saw full of men with those uniforms, many of them were empty again. Ordinary people wearing ordinary clothes sat in some of those seats dotted around, but there was one man wearing a uniform, sat in their very seats. He stood up. He adjusted himself. He took his cap from under his arm. He placed it on his head. straightened his jacket, and started to walk out into the aisle. He smiled at them both, nodded, and started to walk towards the back of the auditorium again. They started to run up towards their seats. They were worried that some of their belongings might have disappeared. They were worried. But as they got to their seats, they could see the man at the top of the aisle slowly vanish, fading away. The RAF did, along with the military, take over the Winter Gardens during the war years. It was used as a training area. Many military men and women would have sat in the Opera House in those very seats. Perhaps that's where they were giving their orders, not just training. Do some of them still visit? I think so. And I believe that's what people see. Some of those men and women have returned to the Winter Gardens, somewhere they knew very well. Speaking of theatres, I want to take you to my favourite building in Blackpool, just down from the Winter Gardens. It's called the Grand Theatre, a glorious Grand Theatre. It opened in 1894. Its interior was designed by a very famous theatre architect called Frank Matcham. He also designed the original Opera House. And if you've been in the Tower, he designed the Tower Circus, the Tower Ballroom, many other buildings around the country and beyond. However, the Grand has always been described as Matcham's masterpiece, Victorian theatre at its best. And I do gush about the Grand Theatre, and I make no apologies for that. And maybe I should explain that I may be known sometimes as the Victorian ghost hunter, the founder of supernatural events, taking people on ghost hunts and investigations and doing ghost walks and ghost tram tours. But I have had real jobs in the past. And one of those jobs was in the Grand Theatre. And it was whilst I worked at the Grand Theatre that I started doing my events. However, the reason I started doing my events was because I became intrigued with the stories that people had been telling for years about the ghosts inside the Grand. There are many, and many nights I stayed in the Grand Theatre. I would almost carry out many investigations while I worked, or in some of the evenings when I was in the building and overnight. But many of those stories I have dismissed. Not everything that goes bump in the night is a ghost. I know this, you know this. Many old buildings, creaky floorboards, temperatures rising and falling, wood expanding and contracting can cause many different sounds and things to move. But there were some stories that I couldn't dismiss. I remember talking to an old manager of the Grand Theatre, a lovely gentleman, sadly no longer with us. And he told me one of his stories. And he told me to tell it on my ghost stories, on my ghost walks. And I did for a while. And it was his story, Paul's story, of how some nights at the end of the show, when everyone had left the auditorium, he would sometimes be there and the last person to leave, even after the front of house have left after cleaning up and checking the building. He would sometimes come into the auditorium and onto the stage. He loved the Grand Theatre. It was his baby. In fact, he was the Grand Theatre's manager more than once. But some nights he would come onto the stage and he would just open the curtain so he could stare out into the beautiful auditorium. And on occasions, he felt that he wasn't on his own. He used to put it down to just the eerie atmosphere of being inside the theatre's auditorium, on the stage, on his own, late at night. But sometimes things did happen. Prompt corner, where the staff would sit, the crew. Beside that area, sometimes there would be tables with props. Props for actors and actresses when they're on stage, running on stage, they would grab those props and run on and do their scene. Nobody would touch anything. Prop table, of course they wouldn't. But sometimes he would hear a noise as if something was moving, and he would, when he was leaving, go past that area. And that's when he would see that props that were on the table were no longer on the table. Some were on the stage. Who moved them? The ghosts of the grand. But many times he'd been on that stage and lights would flicker on the stage, and you wouldn't be able to turn those lights on while stood on the center of the stage. You would have to be to the side. He was the only one in the theatre. Let's go away from the Grand Theatre. Let me take you to Fleetwood. Fleetwood is older than Blackpool. In fact, going back a few years, the Wire Archaeological Society have found Roman remains close to Fleetwood. So it does date back some time. In Fleetwood, there is an amazing hotel. One of my favourite hotels in the Fylde Coast. It's called the North Euston. People who used to travel from London to Scotland many years ago, they would be able to travel by train only as far as Fleetwood, where there was a main train terminal. The trains in those days, they weren't powerful enough to go up over the hills and mountains of Cumbria into Scotland. So they would alight at Fleetwood and they would get the boats, the ships, and they would sail to Scotland. They would stay in the hotels, perhaps overnight, until those ships would sail the next day. And one hotel, the North Euston, was built for that very reason. It was named after London's Euston Station. So you went from London's Euston to Fleetwood's North Euston Hotel, where you would stay. It's not always been a hotel, though. It again was taken over by the military. It was a musketry at one point. Now, the North Euston is huge, and its cellars are amazing. The full length and width of the building, in fact, in one area now is a full gym. But many who work in the North Euston, they have to go down into the cellars. They'll go down, it might be for the bar, to get stock, to bring up chairs and tables for the function rooms. But when they go into the cellars, they sometimes see what shouldn't be there. Men walking through the cellars, holding old weapons, muskets, rifles, marching through the cellars, going to the very end, turning left away from them, and going through what is described just as an archway. We believe that across the Fylde Coast, smuggling was rife. And out of many buildings, it's said, in the cellars were tunnels that used to lead out into farm areas, down onto the beach. And North Euston was one of those that was said to have tunnels that left from its cellars, going across the gardens to where the beach was. In fact, if we go back probably about 9 years ago, one of the managers that worked at North Euston, they did uncover part of a tunnel, which is why there is this archway that people see these men carrying guns and rifles going through. They were able to dig back a little bit, but then it became a solid wall. Those men, were they men from the School of Musketry? Was that how they left the North Euston, so that they wouldn't scare the residents that lived around the hotel? Obviously, they wouldn't want to walk out the front doors carrying these weapons. So perhaps they did leave via the tunnels. Is that what the staff see now? Things do move in the cellars. They'll go down to bring up stock, as I've said, for the bar. Tables and chairs for the function rooms are stored down there as well. And when they go down into specific areas to bring up what's required, sometimes they're not where they should be. Barrels have been moved to the opposite side of the cellar. Chairs that should be stacked up aren't stacked up. The North Euston Hotel has quite a few ghosts. In fact, on its first floor, a little girl is seen skipping down the corridor. She disappears inside one of the bedrooms through the door. The door is shut. Many who have been in that bedroom have suddenly seen a little girl come through the door into their room. They've screamed, they've run out. The little girl has been seen in another room. But when she's seen there, it's because she has decided to wake up those that are staying in the room. In the middle of the night, when they're sleeping, they suddenly feel the bed moving up and down. And when they open their eyes and reach over and press the lamp and light the room, they see a little girl bouncing up and down on the end of their bed. She giggles, she laughs, she runs out through the closed door. The little girl hasn't just been seen by those staying in the hotel. She's been seen by room service staff, those that are around that area, the corridors, early in the morning, throughout the day. They probably see her more than any, because in between the two rooms where this little girl has been seen is another door, and it is a store cupboard. It has the supplies that those staff who clean rooms, that's one of their areas. And they will be going onto that floor, opening and closing that door, getting supplies whenever they need. So it is no surprise that they see this little girl, perhaps more than anyone. I'm going to keep you in Fleetwood because we have what's called the Marine Hall. The Marine Hall is perhaps used mostly as a theatre. Not a theatre in its conventional self, seen with lots of tiers and balconies and seats and a huge stage, but it's more like a hall. And they bring rows and rows of chairs out to watch the shows on the stage. There have been many tales of a gentleman that has been seen inside the Marine Hall, usually by the staff. I remember one member of the front of house team. We're going back some years. He had only just started. And at the end of a show, when all the audience have gone and everyone, the crew and the actors and performers, the actresses have all left the stage and the dressing room, usually the front of house team are still there, tidying up the auditorium, sweeping, lifting rubbish. And he remembers on his very first night, he saw over next to the stage a man who was using a very large, wide brush, sweeping close to the stage. Now, those brushes, if you look in theatre, if you've been on stage, you will have seen them before. They're usually used just before a show would start to make sure that anything that is lying on that stage is swept away. They're huge. And this man is using it on the floor in the auditorium. He remembers going to the front of house manager and asking who the man was. Is he one of the volunteers? Is he helping? Is he a caretaker? Front of house manager didn't know what he meant. There's only the staff and me. That's all that's here. Just you, me, and 4 others. He asked to describe the man. And he did. He was wearing a waistcoat. He had a cap on his head. Just dressed normally. Nothing special. Front of house manager smiled and said, no. It's not one of the staff. It's not one of the volunteers. He used to be the caretaker here. He does come in every now and again just to say hello. The young front of house man, he just didn't understand. Well, he comes in at the end of the show to say hello to who and just decides to help brush up. No. He passed away many years ago. He comes from the other side to visit. He's checking up on us. Again, a wonderful, wonderful theatre. and a wonderful building. If you come to this area, do go and have a look around. But let's come back a little bit, back in towards Blackpool, because there are many stories, again, all along our coast. And you may not know, but Blackpool's coast, it really is a ship graveyard. There are recorded 157 shipwrecks just off the coast of Blackpool, all the way between Fleetwood and Central Pier in Blackpool. Just beyond the beach, the sea, well, that stretch of water used to be the main shipping route for cargo ships coming from Europe and America to Liverpool and Fleetwood, our main ports back in the day. Many of those cargo ships were old wooden boats. We're very well known along the Fylde coast for severe storms. Huge waves would crash over onto the prom, onto the road, crashing up against some of the buildings on the opposite side. Many of those old wooden cargo ships, they would get caught up in the storms. They would be washed ashore, capsizing on the beach. Many tossed around in those waves, they would just break up and they would sink beneath the waters. At the end of North Pier, there used to be a jetty that was built, extending that pier out by 3/4 of a mile into the Irish Sea. Ships cannot moor at the end of North Pier. The tide is either too low, or when it is high enough, it's high tide. It's dangerous. They cannot do it. So we built a jetty. We used to have steam ships taking people on pleasure cruises to the Isle of Man, North Wales, South Lakes. And sadly, many of those cargo ships in the storms, they crashed into that jetty. Their hulls were ripped. They too sank beneath the waves. Lives were sadly lost. At the end of North Pier now, there is a fishing club. The men and women of that fishing club, as long as the tide is right, they will be at the end of North Pier fishing, day or night. And at night, that's when they hear, and that's when they see things. They'll be at the end of the pier with only one light lit to keep them company. The rest of the pier is in darkness. And when they're on their own, that's when they hear men screaming and crying for help just off the end of the pier. They hear bells. I don't mean somebody cycling up and down the pier going ding ding. I mean huge, deep, booming bells just coming off the pier, but there's nobody there. Blackpool sometimes can be shrouded in mist and fog. You could be stood on the prom looking for Blackpool Tower. It's gone. It's disappeared. You could be stood on the prom and the whole of North Pier has vanished into the fog. Imagine what it's like at the end of North Pier now, half a mile out into the sea, in the middle of the dark, in the middle of the fog. It is like something from that horror movie, from that novel, The Fog. Because they don't just hear men's voices crying and screaming for help. They hear them whispering around them in the fog. They don't just hear bells. They hear foghorns coming from just beyond the pier. I've already explained, ships cannot moor anywhere near the end of the pier. They see lights, shadows that glide in silently, pausing before moving on, making no sound at all. I've spent many nights at North Pier with the men and women of that fishing club, and many on my own. I will agree with them that North Pier is haunted, not just by the lovely Victorian lady I've mentioned, but by the lost souls of those we're still somewhere out there, beneath the waters, beneath the sands, those who lost their lives in those ships. We're coming to the end of our little chat with our little stories, and I'm sure somebody will be coming along to join me in a second. But for now, let me tell you one final story. We're going to move a little bit further in to Blackpool. I'm going to take you to St. John's Square. St. John's Square is named after an old church. Blackpool Town Centre's oldest church, St. John the Evangelist. If we go back in time, there used to be an old graveyard in front of that church. Unfortunately, back in 1929, it was decided that all the coffins and their contents would be moved, and they went off to a more modern cemetery, Leighton Cemetery. All those coffins, it's believed 327, were dug up and reburied. And they built gardens and pathways, things that our visitors, our holiday makers would appreciate, perhaps rather than an old graveyard. If we go back 11 years, in 2009, they decided to make more changes in that area. They put down cobblestones, water fountains, a huge statue of a diver on a wave with rocks that light up. When they were making those changes, coffins were found. Those coffins were removed and they were taken to a cemetery and they were buried elsewhere. But shortly after they opened that area, people started to see a little girl and a little boy playing through the water fountains. And the reason they remember this little girl and little boy is because they saw them in the morning. They were seen in the afternoon, in the evening, even in the middle of the night. But there were never any adults close by. That was 11 years ago. They saw this little girl. They described her as being maybe 12 or 13. Dirty fair hair pulled back in a ponytail. She wore a navy blue pinafore-style school dress, a bit tattered and torn, plimsolls on her feet. A little boy would have been probably around 8. Navy shorts, a grey grubby t-shirt, barefoot. But they would play through these water fountains, having fun, screaming, laughing, playing chase, tag. And people always remembered seeing them 11 years ago. And 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5 years ago, people still saw the same children playing through the water fountains. 4, 3, 2, 1. Even this year, people have seen the same children. Why are they seeing the same children? Why suddenly would they appear when they found those coffins? Were they the children that were buried in St. John's graveyard? Do they come to play in that area still? The surprising thing is, 9 weeks ago when I started to do the Blackpool Ghost Walks, I walked down past that area. The water fountains were switched on. They haven't been on for quite a few years. There's been problems with piping and so on. But suddenly I spoke out loud and people that were near me, they stared at me because I did say, oh my goodness, the water fountains are on. And the reason it was such a surprise that the water fountains were on is that people who have seen the children playing through the water fountains within the last 4 or 5 years, they've always said that the water fountains were on. They couldn't. They couldn't have seen the water fountains on. The water fountains have not been working. Or have they? For the children. I hope you've enjoyed my tales. Perhaps you'll join me on a Blackpool Ghost Walk or the Ghost Tram Tour. I tell different stories. I change the stories around. Not just during the year, but every year there are different locations that I stop at. Stories that I have been researching many years, talking to others. They will sometimes come in, and some of my stories will leave, maybe to return another day. This year, the stories were picked by those who have been on the ghost walks over the last 10 years. I asked through Facebook, tell me your favorite location. And those stories this year are a mixture of old, very old, and some relatively new ones. Next year, when the walks start up again, there will be new stops, new stories, new locations. But until then, I hope you've enjoyed my tour.
Those stories, Stephen, are absolutely amazing. The comments that we've had are, that they could listen to you for hours, and always great listening to those stories. And, people have been saying they can't wait to see you again. And obviously, where can people see you and how do they get in contact with you?
The easiest thing to do is go on to Facebook or my website. My website is supernaturalevents.co.uk or Facebook.com/supernatural events. And you'll find out all about the event that I run, whether it's a ghost hunt, a paranormal investigation, or whether I'm hosting the ghost walks or the ghost tram. But also, at the moment, because it has been very difficult this year for everyone, of course, many of my events have cancelled. And I've taken some advice from dear friends who have been trying to persuade me to do things online. I'm happy usually to talk in the background, on the phone, on radio. I tend to shy away from cameras, but I've also started something called the Victorian Ghost Hunter Investigates. And it's a little series of online videos. They last somewhere between 50 minutes and an hour. And the Victorian ghost hunter, because you can't come on the ghost hunt, he is taking the ghost hunt to you. So he's going into some of these locations, some I've already mentioned, and he will do a tour around, telling some of the stories and doing some mini investigative work. The first one aired last Sunday, and there's another one coming out next Sunday as well. So do have a look on Facebook and on the website supernaturalevents.co.uk.
Well, I definitely will be watching. I will definitely be tuning into that. Now, sadly, we've run out of time, but I suppose you could possibly go on for hours and hours. But
until the voice runs out.
But it's been so wonderful to have you on our Festival of the Unexplained, Stephen. And I do hope that you get some more radio and you do some more of these, because you have such a captivating voice and it's amazing. And I'm so thankful that we've had you.
It's my privilege to be asked to be part of this with guests who I look up to, I admire. I'm just so pleased and privileged to be here. Thank you for inviting me on, and who knows,
no
probably talk again.
We definitely will, but that's great. So that was Stephen Mercer, and oh my goodness, I was absolutely amazed. I've never heard some of them stories, but if you get a chance, log on to the Victorian Ghost Hunter. He has a new show dropping on Sunday, so I definitely will be catching up with that. Now, next, we've got the beautiful Penny Griffiths-Morgan, author, and she's talking to Karen about her books. So stay tuned, and we will be back shortly.